mul'ate gaafa gumaan dubbate yaa yaartuu yaada booroo eessuma seemisa. Onnataa kaayyoonneera jabaa onnee sibiila kutataa warra beebee amboo biqilchee dhiira oromiyaan dhabdee dhiira oromoon dhabee dhiira. Bokkisaa akka leencaa tokkicha hanga kuma goota onneen sibiilaa goota onneen ibidda jaaluu fitee nama. Lubbuu biili qabaatuuf mafaan goola naannaa sabaa koof lolee du'een abdii isaa gaata sabaa koof lolee du'een raadda isaa biruuta jette shushuraaniira kaayyoon kees kufee nafu dhaloonni bakkaangaa oromoo bakkaangaa. Jagara warra soraa kaagala masara jette onneen uttorte yaa ilma gaabara kuu dachiisis liqimsite Hacaaluu gaafatiki hartuu si galaafate gamtuu si galaafate olis fiignee gadis buunee maaltu jira wanti taane Oromoo hundaa dhonke falmataa akkas.
Finish the dam, to do the other sorts of things that they want to do to develop their country, and that there not be some sort of regional problems over this issue. There is no need for other sorts of things. There are resolutions, and we're going to continue to work. Special Envoy Feltman was just in the region, was just returned, and he was working specifically on this matter. He and others in the administration.
Mr. Chair. Ambassador Feltman, with his time in Israel, his time in Lebanon, he seems to always be in the right place for at the wrong time, but I have great faith in him. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. And I recognize Representative David Cicilline of Rhode Island for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this really important hearing and obviously very timely. And thank you to our witnesses for your service and for your testimony. The crisis in Tigray and in multiple parts of Ethiopia has resulted in some of the worst atrocities the world has seen this century. Scores of civilians have lost their lives, sexual and gender-based violence is rampant, and millions are at risk of severe malnutrition as famine conditions threaten to spread across the country. And the world must not turn a blind eye and must do all it can to foster a peaceful conclusion to hostilities and to provide the humanitarian assistance to the people in this region that will allow them to survive. And so my first question is to you, Ms. Charles. You know, there's been so much evidence and testimony today about gender-based violence and sexual violence. And we know that that's been very present in this conflict, leaving many women, girls, and other vulnerable populations at risk, and so often leaving little accountability for the perpetrators. Could you speak to what USAID is doing and other relevant agencies and organizations to provide victims of sexual violence the support that they need? Is there counseling available? Are there safe houses? Is medical care available? And what is the status of the response to this sexual violence?
Thank you for your question. As you mentioned, the scale of sexual violence in this crisis is horrific, and really has been protection of survivors has been at the center of our response from the beginning. And that's training of social workers, providing safe spaces, counseling services for survivors. And we're able to do this at scale in places where we have access, mainly the major cities in Tigray. But our ability to provide those services in a sustained way is hindered by the continued constraints on access.
Thank you. Ambassador Godhaa, what is the Ethiopian government doing, if anything, to protect refugees from Eritrea that are currently on Ethiopian soil? Has the Ethiopian government, for example, provided assurances that they are doing all they can to curtail the reported activities of the Eritrean military forces stationed in Ethiopia as it relates to refugees, which have been reported to include kidnapping, murders, and even forced repatriation? And so what's the current status of the refugee population?
Congressman, thank you for the question. So the United States is obviously deeply concerned about the protection of refugees. We have raised the importance of the protection of refugees with the government of Ethiopia, to include Prime Minister, on a number of different occasions, and reminded him that he has obligations under international law that must be observed. We are obviously providing a range of assistance ourselves, and others are doing so through UNHCR and other organizations. Clearly, there have been abuses. At least 2 camps in northern Tigray were destroyed. There are still Eritrean refugees who cannot be located. There are a number of efforts underway to address this situation, but clearly the government of Ethiopia has obligations that it needs to live up to protect the Eritrean and other refugees that are in the country. Ethiopia has currently about 800,000 or so refugees in the country.
Thank you, Ambassador. I hope that message, and I'm certain it is, will be repeated to the Ethiopian government over and over again. And my final question, Mr. Ambassador, is, so often when we see conflicts like this, there's a sense that, the perpetrators somehow escape accountability. And so how can the United States foster greater UN Security Council engagement with the conflict, particularly to ensure that there is accountability for ongoing atrocities?
Thank you, Congressman. The United States strongly believes that the UN Security Council should have an open discussion on this matter. There have already been several any other business and also an interactive dialogue discussion of the crisis, but more is needed. There should be an open discussion. This crisis is a threat to regional peace and security, and it really requires and deserves, and frankly, it is very unfortunate that there has not been an open council discussion. Beyond that, though, we are looking at other mechanisms, both to investigate and to hold accountable individuals who commit atrocities or human rights violations. We've supported the effort by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to investigate. That is an investigation, though. It's not holding people accountable. So we hope that investigation will be completed. We are providing financial support for it. We will be keeping an eye on it to ensure that it is a genuine investigation that reveals what happened. And the next step after that is to find mechanisms to hold people to account for their actions. And we will look to do that in a variety of ways. And in fact, have already begun the process.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Adam Kinzinger of Illinois for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank the panel for being here today. It's a really important issue, obviously. Mr. godhaa. Many analysts have predicted that extended conflict between the...
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty hearing the question.
Mr. Kinzinger, can you speak up?
Yeah, I'm trying. What about now? How's this? All right, I'll have to come back then if it's not working.
All right.
Go
We'll
to
come
the
back.
next one, that's fine.
Mr. Kinzinger, are you still there?
I'm here, but if you can't hear me, you can go to the next one.
Can you hear him now?
Yeah, I can hear him now. It's very faint. Perhaps, Congressman, if you could just speak up a bit, maybe.
I'll try to speak up. How's this?
Thank you.
That's much better.
That's better.
Okay. Many analysts have predicted that extended conflict between the TPLF and Prime Minister Ahmed will cause a sharp decrease in foreign investment. They're a major contributor to Ethiopia's national economy. Amidst ongoing economic strains caused by the pandemic and economic crisis would make an already dire situation catastrophic. How can the U.S. support continued foreign investment into key national industries while holding those who have committed atrocities accountable for their crimes?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Look, the United States, continues to want to help the Ethiopian people. You can see that in our assistance in a variety of ways. We continue to provide support, whether it's, for example, health support or other assistance to the people of Ethiopia. Our concern at the moment, obviously, however, is that given the scale of the atrocities, given the scale of what's happened, actions that would directly benefit the government of Ethiopia at this moment are more of a challenge. We continue to have U.S. businesses and others operating in the country. We continue to provide them support and assistance, but clearly it can't be business as usual, given the scope and the scale of the horror of what's happened in Tigray.
Well, let me ask you too, how do you expect a protracted conflict or an economic crisis in Ethiopia to impact broader regional stability in the Horn of Africa?
I think if the conflict continues, Congressman, that it will drive further displacement of individuals. There'll be further potential for refugee flows, particularly if the conflict ends. We've already seen a small flow of refugees, for example, into Kenya from Oromia. We've seen a flow into Sudan from Beni Shangul, and there is the possibility for greater displacement. I think widely up through the Red Sea region and further.
And let me ask you too, since the hostilities have started, we've gotten reports that multiple actors have committed appalling atrocities, as you well know, in Tigray, including civilian massacres, rapes, lootings, destruction of property, including schools, hospitals, and churches. How can we help to facilitate, we being the United States, help to facilitate peace agreements between the TPLF and the government without negating the crime? So in essence, still holding people accountable.
Thank you, Congressman. The first step, as I've indicated, is a permanent ceasefire that's achieved through negotiation and discussion. That is essential. That's the starting point. We are in touch with all of the parties to this conflict. We are urging them to, as I said, agree to a cessation of hostilities, put it in place. And after that, to allow full humanitarian access, unhindered humanitarian access to help the people in need. As part of that as well, we will facilitate and assist with investigations such as the one being carried out by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN. And we will look at whether other investigations can be supported, and we will hold people to account. I think we can do all of these things. Obviously, it's going to require some time, but the first step is a full ceasefire.
Yeah, thank you. I have a few more questions I'll just submit for the record, but they're somewhat repetitive to the point that I think a ceasefire is important. Getting to negotiating, creating real, political stability as best we can. We obviously have a very strong voice there. It's important that we recognize that and use it. I appreciate all the good work you're doing, Mr. Chairman, and because of the technical difficulties, I'll yield back the last minute.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Dina Titus of Nevada for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank our guests for being with us today. I'd like to follow up on a couple of questions that were asked previously. One was asked by Mr. Shabbat, talking about how China's investment in Ethiopia has kept them from being less cooperative when it comes to ending the conflict. I wonder what the motivation might be, if you've looked at, or I'm sure you have, of Russia and India as also not being helpful or acting as roadblocks in this process.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Both Russia and India have also opposed action at the UN Security Council, open hearings, discussions at the Council on this. I think in those instances as well, they prefer to see the Tigray crisis as an internal conflict as a result of their own situations, perhaps, or perhaps as a result of relations that they have with the government of Ethiopia. We do continue to urge them, as we urge everybody, to engage on this issue, though. The stability and long-term territorial integrity of Ethiopia is at risk, and we would urge and encourage all partners and all friends of Ethiopia to press the government to take steps for an inclusive dialogue and to address the crisis in Tigray.
Well, speaking of territorial integrity, you said earlier that you're committed to maintaining the existing borders of Ethiopia. I wonder what the U.S. is actually doing to try to address some of these other nationalist groups that are where there's unrest, or they're starting to pop up, or there's some threat around the edges in Ethiopia.
We've certainly engaged, Congresswoman, with the Prime Minister and with a wide range of other actors in Ethiopia on this question. We've done so privately, we've done so publicly, we've encouraged an inclusive dialogue. Beyond that, however, we have put in place a range of programs through USAID and other organizations to help address the drivers of conflict across the country. There are border disputes, long-time grievances that remain in place. And so we have sought through these programs to address the problems. We also have engagements to address the problem of hate speech, work in that area and work in other areas. I don't know if Assistant Administrator Charles wants to say something about, for example, some of our programs to address this through USAID.
Thank you.
Yes, a lot of our work in Ethiopia is around working with youth and women's groups to address intercommunal violence, to also support independent media and other actors in the civil society that can help again with local conflict resolution.
Do any of these NGOs or any of your programs address the ethnic conflicts that are internal in Ethiopia?
Yes, much of that work that I just described is really about looking at the root causes and very local level dynamics around intercommunal violence, ethnic violence, trying to build bridges among the youth and women in particular.
What about any kind of political programs that encourage democracy or participation or legislative processes, rule of law that include all different ethnic groups?
Historically, USAID has provided support to electoral processes, expanding political participation, independent media, civil society, all aimed at building kind of that democratic muscle in Ethiopia.
You think it's working?
I'll defer that question to Ambassador Gunek.
And let's just say we continue to work at the problem. It is a challenge. Ethiopia has a way to go yet, unfortunately.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize Representative Tim Burchett of Tennessee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate that. Thank you all for being here. With reports of clashes between the Sudanese and Ethiopian forces at El Fashaga and joint military exercises between Egypt and Sudan, is there a chance that this conflict evolves into a regional war?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, the Al Fashaga border dispute poses a risk of conflict in the area. It is a deep dispute, and it is of considerable concern to the United States. It is something that we have discussed with both Addis Ababa and Khartoum, with leaders in both countries, urging them to find a solution. But it is a risk.
Okay. Has the conflict negatively affected the anti-al-Shabaab efforts in Somalia?
The Ethiopians do provide troops to AMISOM in support of the efforts to, address the threat from al-Shabaab in Somalia. They had also provided some additional, maybe 4,000 or so bilateral forces, so outside of the AMISOM construct. Those bilateral forces, we believe, have largely been withdrawn. So far, we don't assess that there's been much impact on the effort to address the problem of al-Shabaab, the withdrawal of those Ethiopian forces. But it is obviously something that we are continuing to monitor and look at very closely.
Okay. Sudan has stated that they are concerned about Ethiopian UN peacekeeping forces stationed in Abyei. Do they have a right to be worried?
I think that the situation with those forces has changed, and it is something, though, that we are looking at and also engaged with the Sudanese on. It is a concern.
Okay. Administrator Power said that over 900,000 people are currently experiencing famine in Ethiopia. What are the biggest obstacles to that humanitarian response effort?
We do believe about 900,000 people are facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity. The concerns have really been blocking of access by the armed actors in Tigray, as well as some bureaucratic obstacles provided by the government of Ethiopia. With the unilateral ceasefire declared yesterday, we're hopeful that may potentially open up access to reach those people that have been out of reach. But we need a lifting of the communications blackout that's currently on Tigray right now. We need the Amharic regional forces to remove checkpoints from the three main access roads. And we also need the TPLF, which now controls quite a lot of territory, to allow for that unhindered access as well.
Okay. Thank you. I'll yield back the remainder of time. Before I do, my neighbor, his daughter adopted a beautiful little girl from Ethiopia. Her name's Anna, and just an incredible little girl. And I sure would hope that they could find some peace in that region. Just be my wish for that. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you, brother.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back his time. I now recognize Representative Susan Wild of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I'd like to direct my question to Ambassador Godek. As tensions with Egypt and Sudan over the Grand Renaissance Dam project continue to rise, might you be able to provide an update on the administration's attempts to address the dispute? I'm concerned that with so many actors, both countries and organizations getting involved now, that it's going to be particularly difficult for the administration to devise a strategy for achieving an equitable resolution and avoiding additional escalation. Just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So the United States is engaged on the agencies. We're in constant communication with them. Proposals have been put forward and are being developed that would, I think, resolve this matter. But again, it's a question of political will more than technical solutions. The technical solutions are available. So we will continue to press the parties to agree to technical solutions, which again, I think meet the needs of all of the parties.
Thank you. And switching gears, assuming a ceasefire in the short term, does the administration have a plan to work with the African Union and regional governments to support some kind of political settlement in the medium to long term?
Congresswoman, yes, thank you. We are certainly very much engaged with the African Union and all of the regional governments. We're in almost constant communication with the AU and with regional partners, with like-minded partners in Europe and elsewhere. We have been looking at the question of how to facilitate a political dialogue, an inclusive dialogue, and really also address specifically the situation of Tigray. We have offered a number of models and suggestions on how progress might be made on these challenges. And we hope that the government will take up these suggestions and ideas. We are going to remain engaged, very much committed to finding a resolution to this. And we hope to move this interim ceasefire to a permanent ceasefire. And again, begin the work that needs to be done to provide relief.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize Representative Dan Muser of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Thank you to both of you for being here with us. As was mentioned, yesterday, the NDF forces withdrew from Tigray and declared, I understand, an immediate and unilateral ceasefire. Why did that happen, Ambassador?
I'm sorry.
What caused that to happen?
What caused that to happen? Congressman, there's still a lot that we don't know for certain, but what I can say is this. Clearly, the TPLF, or really the TDF, the Tigrayan Defense Forces, have in the past couple of weeks achieved some military victories, particularly in central Tigray. They were clearly advancing toward Mekelle, so there were some military successes by the Tigrayans. At the same time, I would also just note that there had been discussions as well about the possibility of a ceasefire. Earlier, there have been indications that the government of Ethiopia wanted to take steps after the June 21st election to resolve the crisis there. So I can't give you a definitive answer as to what caused this particular announcement, but there clearly are factors involved.
Okay, thanks. If Tigray laid down its arms, would that bring ceasefire or escalate hostilities?
If the Tigrayans laid down their arms, our objective again is a permanent ceasefire, a negotiated ceasefire that really gets the parties to the table to address the deeper underlying issues of Ethiopia. So it is absolutely essential to have the conflict end. There are clear ways to do that, I think, and we are engaged with all of the parties to help. Well, the Chinese in particular have big investments in Ethiopia. China holds billions of dollars of Ethiopian debt. The Chinese have built infrastructure projects, invested in commercial engagements, manufacturing, and other things. But the Chinese, when we have engaged with them over this issue, have, indicated that they believe this is an internal matter for Ethiopia.
Would you be able to say they're being more supportive of peace, hopefully, but on the Ethiopian government, the NDF side, or Tigrayans?
What I would hope is that the Chinese, and indeed all countries, friends and partners of Ethiopia, will engage in a fashion that helps bring all of the parties together in a way that is productive and which, again, achieves a long-term solution to the problems. That is certainly what we're going to be urging the Chinese, the Russians, in addition to neighbors, like-minded partners, and everyone else to do.
Do you find that they are making themselves available and are accessible to the U.S., keeping you updated, as well as very much desire our involvement in helping resolve the situation?
We have engaged with the Chinese and continue to do so on this issue and on Ethiopia in a variety of forums in a variety of ways. So we are speaking with them.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Dean Phillips of Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Greetings to our witnesses, and thank you for being with us. It's heartbreaking and infuriating, frankly, to watch a Nobel Peace Prize winner so quickly migrate to an enabler at best, perhaps, an architect at worst of the worst humanitarian crises of this era. And I have to say, it's equally infuriating and heartbreaking that the world's most well-resourced nation, our United States, seems unwilling or unable to stop it. But I need not cover that ground because I think it has been covered already. I wish to talk about the recent elections on June 21st. Took place against the backdrop of horrible instability, of course, some estimating that up to a quarter of the regular electorate was either unwilling or unable to participate. The boycott of the elections by opposition parties, detention of vocal political leaders, and ongoing violence across the country highlight the erosion of democratic governance in Ethiopia. So, Mr. Ambassador, to you, in early May, the Ethiopian government, of course, designated both the TPLF and the OLA as terrorist organizations. So how does that designation change the prospects for a peaceful political environment and a healthy democracy in Ethiopia?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. We don't share the view that the TPLF and the OLF should have been designated as terrorist groups. We certainly have not done so ourselves at this point. Obviously, that also, for example, raised the difficulty of getting humanitarian assistance into these areas in some instances. And so it was problematic. What we would urge at this point, the government of Ethiopia, is just the importance of talking with the various organizations to include, all of the actors in the country, certainly all those that have engaged in the conflict in Tigray, and find a way forward. There needs to be this inclusive dialogue, and it needs to involve the parties. And without that, the country is at risk of further destabilization. The election that took place on June 21st, again, we commend those Ethiopians who choose to take part in it, but we certainly agree that it was not free or fair for most Ethiopians. And it is not the solution to the country's problems. It's a one-off event. There needs to be an inclusive dialogue that resolves the underlying issues that many of the people in the country have.
I know I speak for many of my colleagues when I say we agree. With the remainder of my time, I want to ask about Hacaaluu Oromoonni, of course, the Oromo activist and singer who was assassinated 1 year ago today. In August of 2020, a year ago, I sent a letter with 19 of my colleagues requesting a transparent and independent investigation into his murder. Last October, the State Department responded by saying, quote, "The government of Ethiopia condemned Hundesa's killing and is conducting thorough investigations into both his killing and the violence that followed to ensure those culpable are brought to justice. The department has observed thus far that judicial processes and the treatment of detainees has proceeded in a manner that is broadly consistent with international law and Ethiopia's political reform priorities, albeit with the challenges due to COVID-19, end quote. So a lot has changed clearly since last October, but how would you characterize the current judicial process and the treatment of detainees, particularly opposition leaders right now?
So broadly speaking, Congressman, we're continue to have concerns, obviously, about the political environment in Ethiopia. And there have been detentions of a number of politicians, a number of other activists and others. We have engaged with the government on these detentions. We strongly believe that it's essential that any legal process proceed in accord with the rule of law. We have sought, in some instances, access to individuals, not always had the opportunity for that access. But it is critically important in this environment that no one be persecuted or prosecuted simply because of their political views, and that any legal process, again, be conducted in accordance with the rule of law.
And are you aware of the status at all of the independent investigation into Hacaaloo's murder specifically?
Congressman, I'd have to get back to you on that specific question, and I'd be happy to do so.
We'd welcome it. Thank you very much to both of you for being here. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative August Pfluger of Texas, who's the vice ranking member for the Subcommittee on Europe, Energy, Environment, and Cyber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for your time today. I think the conflict that we're seeing is on pace to become one of the worst humanitarian crises in decades. And there's estimates that place the number of people suffering from man-made drought conditions at almost 1 million, maybe more. I think it only underscores the critical need for the recently announced ceasefire to hold during such critical times as this farming season is upcoming. And we not only need to address the mounting humanitarian crisis, but a return to stability. And just as a precursor for either of you, do you see a clear offender and defender role in this crisis in military parlance?
Congressman, what I would say is that all sides have committed acts, atrocities, provocations, other sorts of things which have been extremely problematic. Clearly, however, the response of the Ethiopian Defense Forces, the Eritrean Defense Forces, and the Amhara forces and militias following the attack in early November by the TPLF, it has been it's created huge issues, and there can be no excuse for the human rights violations, abuses, and atrocities that have been committed. There is no possible justification.
So I guess that
have happened.
To summarize, is there an offender and a defender, or is it more atrocities on both sides that both are wrong from your perspective?
I would say both sides have committed acts which are a major problem. And
so the Horn of Africa not only is of high strategic importance to the United States and our allies and partners, but also that of our adversaries. We've seen China grow in their malign influence on the continent and establish their first forward naval base, in neighboring Djibouti. And where we find instability, particularly in these very strategic locations, we often find that our adversaries will be there to exploit the circumstances and further their own malign agenda. I know these questions have been asked in a variety of forms, but I'm very interested in understanding from your perspective where those specific vulnerabilities lie for countries such as China to exploit, whether it's leveraging debt, whether it's leveraging not only our bilateral relationship, but our own interest.
I don't think that, deep conflict and instability in Ethiopia would be beneficial to China or indeed to anyone. As I'd indicated earlier, the Chinese do have extensive commercial relationships, investments, They do hold substantial billions of dollars worth of Ethiopian debt. I don't think that anyone would benefit, from broad instability and chaos in Ethiopia and across the region. There might be some who would seek to exploit it if it did take place, but we are going to work to ensure that it doesn't.
Well, that's good to hear. Ms. Charles, for you, just on the food security side, what do you see if this ceasefire doesn't hold? I mean, obviously unilateral in nature, but if it doesn't hold, what is the outlook for food security inside Ethiopia this summer and into the remainder of the year?
As you mentioned, we already have 900,000 people we estimate are in catastrophic conditions of food insecurity, a further nearly 2 million in emergency levels of food insecurity. If this cessation of hostilities doesn't hold, if we don't see unobstructed access, we're facing widespread famine by the end of the year.
And will it affect outside of the borders of Ethiopia, the region writ large, or will it be localized?
The extreme levels of food insecurity that we're seeing are concentrated in Tigray, but there's no question that level of food insecurity death could have regional impacts.
Assistant Secretary, for your question for you, I mean, what are the chances that the cessation of hostilities actually holds?
Congressman, all I can tell you is we're going to do everything we can to persuade the parties to have it hold, and that all parties agree to a cessation of hostilities. We will work toward that end.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Social Impact, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and apologies for retreading anything that we've covered. I had another hearing, as I know others have been in and out as well. But just yesterday, the Ethiopian government declared an immediate unilateral ceasefire after Tigrayan fighters recaptured Mekelle, a significant setback for the Ethiopian government. There's a lot of uncertainty over the situation, and I'm looking for some clarity on where we are and what we can expect. And I understand that many thousands of Ethiopian troops have been captured by advancing Tigrayan forces. Can you confirm this? And how many Ethiopian prisoners are we looking at, and how are they being treated?
Congressman, the situation indeed is very fluid, and there are lots of questions about what is precisely happening on the ground. We are working to get better information, but I don't have specific numbers at the moment in terms of Ethiopian troops which may have been captured by the TDF.
But you confirm that there have been some number of troops that have been captured?
Congressman, I would have to get back to you. I don't have confirmation at the moment of that's the case.
Okay. In May, the administration levied visa sanctions on Ethiopian, Eritrean, Amhara, and Tigrayan leaders. In his statement, Secretary Blinken said that despite, quote, significant diplomatic engagement, the parties to the conflict in Tigray have taken no meaningful steps to end hostilities or pursue a peaceful resolution of the political crisis, unquote. What has been the effect of those sanctions? Have the sanctioned individuals or the countries and organizations they work for changed behavior as a result of the sanction? And how are you measuring the effectiveness of these sanctions?
Congressman, thank you for the question. We're obviously looking very closely at the actions, not just the words, of the parties and the organizations that were subject to the sanctions regime, or that are part of the sanctions regime. Clearly this step to put in place an interim ceasefire, hopefully it's a positive step. We welcome it, but it's at the very beginning of a process. So we need to see real progress towards meaningful peace, a restoration of security, humanitarian access, accountability for crimes that have been committed before we're going to be in a position to change what we're doing. At the moment, Congressman, Ethiopia has before it really two roads. It can either begin to pull itself out of this crisis and address the issues and meet the needs of the people, or they can choose to go the other route and continue the conflict. And if that's the choice that they make, then we will continue to use the tools that are available to us, to include visa sanctions and many other potential sanctions that are available in order to encourage progress.
But so we don't have an assessment at this point yet of whether we think those sanctions are having the intended effect or whether they're working.
Obviously, it's only been, just about a month or so, a little bit more since the sanctions regime was announced. So it's still early.
Sure. Then UN Relief Chief Mark Lowcock has gone on the record describing the situation in Tigray as a famine, and the World Food Program, 50,000 people in Tigray are at risk of famine. Despite the suffering, the Ethiopian government refuses to acknowledge this reality. And I'm also concerned about the role the Ethiopian government is playing in perpetuating or exacerbating the famine. And so my question is, how do you assess the Ethiopian government's response to famine in Tigray? Is there any evidence that they or the Eritrean government are using famine and hunger as pressure to starve Tigray into submission? And the situation in Ethiopia seems to meet the definition of famine by all accounts.
We certainly share the assessment, and actually have updated our own analysis to reflect upwards of 800 to 900,000 people are facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity, a further 2 million facing emergency levels. So we're incredibly concerned. We believe famine is likely already occurring in Ethiopia, and widespread famine is likely by the end of the year if we don't have unobstructed access.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I just want to check, is Mr. Jackson, I know he was having, Representative Jackson of Texas, is he on? He was having technical difficulties. Mr. Jackson, can you hear me? Okay. I now recognize then Representative Andy Levin of Michigan, the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Asia, Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this really timely, unfortunately timely hearing. The UK's Telegraph published shocking images of weapons experts who said the burns look consistent with the use of white phosphorus, which is not technically considered a chemical weapon, but is banned under international law for use on human targets. The Ethiopian government denied the report forcefully. Ambassador Godek, are you aware of the reported use of white phosphorus against civilians?
Congressman, yes, we are aware of the reports. We've certainly seen them. What I can tell you is that in all cases where we see reports, we do like this, particularly reports that a particularly heinous act has been committed. We do take a close look at that and use our best available means, and we look to determine whether or not the reports are accurate. In many of these instances, it's been difficult, however, because we do not have unimpeded access to large areas in Tigray, of course.
So you haven't been able to make an assessment as to the validity yet. Does the State Department have the mechanisms in place to assess reports like this independently if you do have access to the area?
We do have a range of ways in which we can determine the validity of reports of atrocities. Obviously, to some degree, we also rely on other organizations. As I've indicated earlier, for example, we are providing support to the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to conduct an investigation. So we rely on a variety of mechanisms and ways.
Let me go to my next question, because I wanted to ask you something related to that. As you know, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has partnered with the government-appointed Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to investigate human rights abuses in Tigray. Many Tigrayans question the credibility of an investigation that includes the EHRC in this way. So, based on what you said before, should I assume that you're confident in this investigation's independence? involving, you have confidence in the HRC and in an investigation they would undertake?
Congressman, we do have the UN and in the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, but I will say this, we are going to be monitoring and looking at this situation very closely. We are aware that it is possible to put organizations and individuals under great pressure, and it's important that there ultimately be an independent investigation. If we determine it's not independent, we will say so, and we will take steps to work to ensure that an independent investigation takes place.
All right, well, I would appreciate it if you'd follow up with me on that particular question, because I'm very concerned about the question of the HRC's independence.
We certainly will follow up, Congressman.
Thank you very, very much. So we've heard a lot about the challenges around humanitarian access to Tigray, obviously, and I was really alarmed to learn about the dangers facing humanitarian actors that do gain access to the region. And
are very focused on supporting our humanitarian partners with their own security planning, but we've also been calling for a scale up in UN security support, as well as really, and this is critical right now, a lifting of the communications blackout that's currently facing Tigray and allowing for the importation of communication equipment that's so essential for allowing our humanitarian partners to move around Tigray with the best possible information.
have most that have been killed by Ethiopian government forces and EPLF, or who's killing these humanitarian workers?
So not all of the humanitarian workers that I've mentioned have been killed have been killed directly by armed actors, although certainly we have indications that our partner staff with REACH and the latest Doctors Without Border Doctors Without Border staff may have been targeted for being humanitarian workers. Investigations are still ongoing to understand exactly who is responsible for those attacks.
And will USAID publish a report on this, or who's responsible for letting us know the outcome of those investigations?
The partners are working very closely with UN OCHA and other actors on the ground to identify and investigate those attacks.
All right, well, my time's expired, Mr. Chairman, but I'd appreciate it if you let us know, when Ms. Charles, when you have good information on that. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Ronnie Jackson of Texas. I think we fixed his technical difficulty, who's the vice ranking member for the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Sir, I've traveled to Ethiopia multiple times during my time at the White House. I've enjoyed my visit to the country. I'm saddened to hear about all the atrocities and the suffering that's happening there now. As a medical doctor, and you mentioned this just briefly, I'm particularly troubled to hear of the death of the 3 Doctors Without Borders employees last week and the that debt or become more financially involved in Ethiopian domestic affairs?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. So China does have an extensive economic and commercial relationship and engagement with Ethiopia. They have significant commercial investments, manufacturing in other areas, economic zones, for example. They have built considerable infrastructure and made a wide range of offers to the government of Ethiopia. They do have substantial debt. The Ethiopians do have substantial debt to China, perhaps estimated maybe $14 billion, which is significant. There are debt negotiations ongoing, and those debt negotiations have not been resolved largely because China so far has not been prepared to move forward, and that has delayed any action at the IMF in terms of additional programming that the IMF might do if it chose to do so. Although obviously the current situation in Tigray, from the administration's perspective, would make that problematic. China has sought to is really not engaged particularly on the question of the atrocities and the conflict in Tigray. As I indicated earlier, for example, they have not been supportive of UN Security Council discussions in open session. They are concerned, I think, about the stability of the region, but at the same time, they believe the conflict in Tigray, for example, is an internal matter for the Ethiopian government.
Okay, thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Is there anything that we can do to balance that, or I guess we're doing everything we can, but
Congressman, we are engaged with the government of China. We are also engaged with, obviously, the Ethiopians and a wide range of others. You know, clearly, we would prefer that all friends, partners, and all those engaged with Ethiopia work together with us to address the crisis in Tigray, and that's what we're urging them to do.
Thank you. I appreciate both the witnesses, and I appreciate your time. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, who is the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to start by quickly saying my heart goes out to everyone at Doctors Without Borders and Save the Children, both of whom had staff in Ethiopia that were brutally murdered in this past week. Mr. Godek, what is the status of the legal determination on atrocity crimes in Ethiopia? When can we expect to see a formal determination on ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. The administration is very strongly believes that human rights abuses, violations, and atrocities have been and are being committed in Tigray. And we've been deeply concerned about that for some time. The use of the specific terms genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity is a legal determination. And we have had an expedited legal and fact-based review underway to make a determination on that. The final decision rests with the Secretary of State. I can't give you a specific timeline. It is his decision to make. Expedited review and is quite far along.
Appreciate that. I have raised that with him and will continue to raise that. So many of my constituents are asking for us to do so. The UN Special Rapporteur made a finding that Somali troops were fighting with the Eritrean military, including in Axum. Have you been able to independently verify these claims?
Congresswoman, we have looked into this question. We are aware that there were some Somali troops that were in Ethiopia, but I can't give you a definitive answer on whether they've been engaged in actual kind of offensive operations. But we are very much looking at that matter.
Do we know the reason why Somali troops are in Ethiopia?
I believe that they were being provided some training by the Eritreans as a result of agreements. That appears to be the reason.
Mhm. So their presence in itself is not a proof that they are there to partake in any of Ethiopian military.
I don't have any additional information at the moment on that, but I'm certainly happy to take a look at it and get back to you with anything further that we have.
The world's focus is very understandably on the horrific situation in Tigray, but I'm also hearing increasingly alarming reports from Oromia. Can you tell us what the situation is in Oromia now?
What I can say, Congresswoman, is that there has been an expansion of the conflict in Oromia. For example, we do see some refugees coming down into Kenya, maybe 750 roughly, something like that, and in other regions as well. And I would say this is just generally representative of the fact that there is been growing conflict in a number of areas. As I said in my testimony earlier, my provided testimony, and these are deeply concerning. I mean, they reflect longstanding grievances, border disputes between peoples, just a number of different issues. And this is what is really tearing at the fabric of the country. And it's why it's so critical that there be this inclusive dialogue that involves all of the people of Ethiopia to reach a better path forward, to find a better path forward that really is genuinely a democratic path and protects and respects human rights. That's what we've been urging the Prime Minister and others in Ethiopia, and frankly also addresses specifically the issues in Tigray.
Someone who was born and raised in the Horn, I do hope that there is a pathway forward that's negotiated, that creates peace, especially in Ethiopia, because I think most of us who come from that region understand that that is the heart of the region. Has Abiy's decision to designate the TPLF and the OLF as terrorist organizations made negotiating peace more difficult in your assessment?
It's complicated some other matters. For example, we're concerned about the impact on humanitarian access that those designations had. But what I would say is, of course, there have not been negotiations yet. But we do believe, as I said, that some sort of dialogue has got to take place. And we would urge the parties to have that dialogue and, not to focus on these designations, which obviously we have not designated those organizations as terrorists.
I know we can talk at length, but my time has expired, so I yield back my time.
That is correct. The gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Young Kim of California, who's the vice-ranking member of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Mix. Ranking Member McCall, who is not here at the moment, but Congressman Smith, good to see you. And thank you for holding this hearing. And I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. The importance of accurate reporting and transparency in conflict zones cannot be overstated in helping protect vulnerable groups from further violence and enabling actors involved in resolving the conflict to make informed decisions. So as we have seen over the past few months, journalists have been harassed, barred from entering Tigray, and even detained for reporting on the conflict. So, question to you, Secretary Godhaa. What is the State Department doing to push for access and protection for journalists and even civilians, providing necessary documentation of these atrocities?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. So freedom of the media is obviously very important to the United States. It is a fundamental right, and we believe everyone should have freedom of expression, and there should be freedom of media. We appreciated the steps, frankly, towards a freer media, more freedom of expression that Prime Minister Abiy took when he first came into office. Unfortunately, the situation has changed dramatically. There is harassment, imprisonment of journalists, and others who appear to simply be expressing their views. We've seen certainly domestic journalists under considerable pressure. but also international journalists. So, for example, New York Times reporter Simon Marks was essentially expelled. The administration has frequently raised this with Prime Minister Abiy, with other senior Ethiopian officials. We have pushed for protection for these journalists. We've pushed for more freedom of the media, and we will continue to do so. It is critically important, as you indicate, that the people of the country have access to accurate, complete reporting, and that's not going to happen in an environment that is controlled and where journalists' voices are suppressed and other voices are suppressed.
Thank you. I would like to talk about the famine and humanitarian issues. So I'd like to address the next question to Ms. Charles. As you know, Administrator Power recently said that over 900,000 people are currently experiencing famine in Ethiopia. We also know that the humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia is not limited to starvation, but also a lack of adequate civilian infrastructure and access to medical care. So what are those biggest impediments to scaling up to the humanitarian response in Ethiopia? I'm going to give you loaded questions all at once so you can answer all at once. So what is the U.S. and our partners doing to overcome these impediments and push the government of Ethiopia to allow for fully unfettered humanitarian access throughout the Tigray region? And further, how much of Tigray is still inaccessible by humanitarian aid, and what regions or specific routes? And can you report on existing blockages to humanitarian aid in recent weeks?
Thank you for those questions. The biggest impediment, no doubt, is the presence of armed actors and the harassment of aid workers, the blockage of assistance. We welcome the unilateral ceasefire announced by the government of Ethiopia yesterday. We're hopeful that this could potentially provide the first necessary step to allow for access, but we immediately need to see the lifting of a communications blackout around Tigray. We also need to see the Amharic regional forces to remove checkpoints from the three main arteries that we need to access in order to access those that are out of reach. Currently, there are more than 1 million people in Tigray that are out of reach of assistance. And so we need all parties to allow for unobstructed access.
Thank you very much. Secretary Godek, I want to turn the attention to GERD, Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So I want to ask you, what is the current impact on the ongoing fighting in Tigray to negotiations with Egypt and Sudan as they work on water projects to make up for the water loss from the Nile as Ethiopia feels its GERD? And what is the current status of these negotiations?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Efforts are ongoing by the administration and by others to assist the parties to reach an agreement on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It is a technical solution that's needed. We believe that there are technical ways to address the interests of Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. The challenge has been the absence of political will at the leadership level. We have been engaged directly with the African Union, which is leading the effort. We've been engaged with the UAE, which has been providing some very useful support and assistance for the negotiations, and we're going to continue to press for a resolution of the dispute over the dam. And as I indicated, we believe it is possible to reach a technical solution that satisfies the needs of all the parties.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Tom Malinowski of New Jersey, who's the Vice Chair of the full committee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador. And actually, I want to start by saying thank you to you, Ambassador Feltman, to the whole State Department team. I think we have seen an intensive full court diplomatic press here. As difficult as the situation remains, I think that needs to be recognized. And I think it's a reminder of just how essential and, yes, indispensable American diplomatic leadership is in these difficult situations. There's no other country that can mobilize a global response of the sort that you are trying to mobilize. And by the way, I think it's also a reminder
of the importance of some institutions that are often disparaged in this body, including those UN institutions like the World Food Program and UNICEF. Where would we be without them? We're pressing for humanitarian access. Everyone on both sides is pressing for access. That's what we mean. We have these agencies that are willing and able to do incredibly difficult work in dangerous situations where we would not want the United States government or military operating. And so I hope we remember that next time we question our funding to those institutions. I want to ask you about some of the sanctions and visa restrictions that you all have put into place. You told us about some of them. There are restrictions on economic and security assistance to the Ethiopian government, wholly appropriate. And I think it's pretty clear based on what we have heard that we've gotten the Ethiopian government's attention, at least with these measures. But I'm a little bit concerned that they have not been followed by some of our key partners, including our key European partners. And I wanted to ask you to comment on that. Why is that? What objections do they have? Would you agree, is it the position of the administration that it would be very helpful for them to follow suit?
Thank you very much, Congressman, and thank you for your remarks about the State Department and the UN and other agencies, which are indeed doing good and important work at this moment in Ethiopia and elsewhere. We have been very closely engaged with our like-minded partners, the European partners, on the situation in Tigray. And I think it's safe to say that they share our assessment of the risks of what's unfolding in Ethiopia, the threat that the Tigray conflict poses to the region, the reality that the other conflicts across Ethiopia pose a danger to the country's stability and national unity. At the same time, they have not always seen or had the same view on how we ought to proceed, when sanctions should be imposed. We've regularly discussed this question with them. I think many of them were looking to wait until after the June 21st elections to take stronger action. We will obviously see now in the first instance what happens as a result of this interim ceasefire and whether there's actual progress out of that. But if there's not, I would hope and I would certainly urge and encourage them to, as we have, take additional steps to put increased pressure on the government of Ethiopia.
Thank you. Speaking of allies and partners, there were some reports earlier on that UAE drones were armed drones were being used that were based in Eritrea. Do you have any evidence of that? And just more generally, can you talk about any efforts we've made to enlist the Emirates, which have been so invested in Ethiopia, as a more helpful partner?
We have been engaged with the Emiratis and frankly with other Gulf states since the very early days of the conflict in Tigray. Special Envoy Feltman, in fact, was just back there again for discussions. We do know that Emirati officials have engaged with the Prime Minister and with others in the Ethiopian government to urge that they find another road in Tigray, that they end the conflict and allow humanitarian access. So we have been very closely engaged with them on this.
Just a final, more kind of general comment or question. When I used to go and engage with the former TPLF-dominated government, their argument was you need a strong authoritarian hand to keep a multi-ethnic country like this from falling apart. And they're probably saying, now we were right. The counter-argument was always that dictatorship freezes conflict, it doesn't resolve it. And that it was more the bad decisions made by Prime Minister Abiy and how he opened the country and then punished his adversaries in Tigray that are responsible. Any thoughts on that never-ending debate?
Congressman, I would say that democracy is always the best solution. Allowing people to openly address grievances and concerns and find peaceful ways to resolve them in some fashion is always a better solution than dictatorship.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Andy Kim of New Jersey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the two of you for coming around. I have to say, it just as difficult as these challenges are, it's great to see such incredible professionals and public servants like the two of you and the many others that work with you on this. Ms. Charles, I'm going to start with you. You've on a number of occasions talked about this famine being man-made. And I wanted to just kind of have you lift up again some of these actions that are intentionally depriving millions of people of the food that they need.
Thank you for that. Yes, as I said, I think we're facing the first widespread famine in Ethiopia since 1983, 1984, and it's entirely man-made. This is because fighting obstructed harvest back in the fall, and then because you've had obstruction of humanitarian access since then, more than 1 million people out of reach of humanitarian assistance because of the actions of actors on the ground. Even in the last few months, reports of armed actors preventing people from planting, threatening people with planting.
And they're actually going after some of the food sources, is that correct? And storage facilities.
And going after looting food sources, storage facilities, wells, and irrigation structures.
You know, over the course of my career, I've certainly seen a number of circumstances that have risen to famine, but this one seems different, you know, in part because of some of what you described there. And Secretary Godek, I mean, I wanted to kind of ask you about this because what it seems like to me is it's about this kind of weaponization of hunger. You know, it's this weaponizing of this to try to achieve your purposes. And in some ways, I'll be honest, famine doesn't seem to quite rise to the occasion to describe something like this. You know, famine feels like something that people in my district much more understand that about natural disasters. So, Mr. Godek, I wanted to ask you, is there a better word to describe what's going on? Does our English language have something more specific that can get at this intentional deprivation that millions are facing?
Congressman, I would certainly agree with you that deliberately starving people to death is an atrocity. It is horrifying. And I don't know that there is another word, perhaps, but it is not acceptable. It is completely outrageous and unacceptable to use food to help you in a conflict. It is absolutely unacceptable.
Thank you for that. Ms. Charles, anything from your end? Any other words that we should be trying to use to describe this?
I don't know that I have a better word, but I take the point that famine can seem quite clinical, technical, and something that happens as opposed to something that's done to people. And I think we've seen time and time again, and we're seeing in Ethiopia right now, that famine often is not the result of natural causes, but instead the result of men.
It's tough to come across these situations of such gravity that it feels like we're at a loss of words, that we're struggling to actually describe this. And what I just put out to you is that the two of you are amongst the greatest experts we have in our country on these. But let's try to make sure that how do we talk and communicate to the American people about what's going on and try to make sure that we're talking about this in a way that they can really truly understand the gravity of what we're dealing with. You know, I try to think through whether that, forced deprivation or starvation crimes or intentional starvation. I'm still struggling with it too, but it's something I'd like to work with you on. And when you talk about it as something man-made, Ms. Charles, I guess a question for you is, I'm trying to get a sense of how inevitable is a mass catastrophe beyond what we've seen so far. If this is man-made, if we were able to stop the fighting, open up the access, is this something that we can still get under control? Or is this now gotten to a level where it will create at least a year or two or more of severe challenges that we'll face going forward?
We believe that famine is already likely occurring in Tigray, but that's not to say that there's not time to avert the worst. And with the unilateral declaration of a ceasefire by the government of Ethiopia yesterday, I think we have a critical moment for all of the parties to demonstrate that they're serious about averting the worst, because the difference really is the difference between tens of thousands and millions of people facing death.
And I can't see how much time I have, but just one last thing. Your numbers are quite different than the IPC numbers in terms of levels. What accounts for that, and how can we make sure that the rest of the world sees it as grave of a situation as you do?
We're sharing our numbers widely. We have a great deal of confidence We think between 700 and 9,000 people are facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity. We've been working with the IPC process, pressing the IPC process to be open and transparent, but the fact of the matter is that that process can sometimes be susceptible to political manipulation.
Great, thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Sarah Jacobs of California, who's the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Corporate Social Impact for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Godek and Ms. Charles, thank you so much for appearing before our committee today on this heart-wrenching crisis. Like many of my colleagues, I'm hearing from my constituents every day about their fears for their loved ones in Ethiopia. And while I at first think many of us were cautiously hopeful declaration of a very unilateral ceasefire, I'm now concerned that this
You're breaking up, Ms. Jacobs.
temporary ceasefire, we're seeing reporting that the TDF and TPLF. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Go ahead. I hear you now.
Okay. We're seeing reporting that the TDF and TPLF forces intend to continue fighting. I just want to know what your assessment of these reports are and what it means for our approach moving forward.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We would urge again that all the parties to this conflict engage in a cessation of hostilities, that they cease fighting, that they take this moment when the Ethiopian government has announced a temporary interim ceasefire to do exactly that, to stop the fighting. We are engaged with all of the parties to this conflict, and that's what we're going to be urging them to do. They need to move into a period of dialogue where the issues between them can be resolved, where humanitarian organizations can have full access to help the people. As we've been hearing throughout this hearing, of course, the humanitarian situation is catastrophic, and we need access. And the only way to get that is to restore security and to get a ceasefire in place. That's certainly the best way to do it.
Thank you. And, Ethiopia has long served as a key anchor for the Horn of Africa and has broad implications for stability in the region. Between what we're seeing in Ethiopia, the GERD dispute and flare-ups in Al-Fashaga on the Sudan border, our response right now is understandably reactive. So, Mr. Godek, in addition to having the special envoy for the Horn, who I think is doing a good job, what is the U.S. doing to be more proactive in the region to prevent second and third order effects from turning into conflicts elsewhere?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So yes, Special Envoy Feltman is deeply engaged. I just want to emphasize that many other administration officials are engaged. The USAID administrator just held an important session recently to help mobilize response to challenges in the region. Our ambassador at the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield's been deeply engaged. Secretary Blinken's been involved. President Biden's been engaged. So there are many administration officials that have been doing this. And I can assure you that we are looking across all of these crises throughout the Horn and seeking to coordinate not just, of course, our own response, but working with like-minded partners, whether it's the Europeans, the regional partners, in East Africa, the African Union. We're working with all of them to address all of these crises. We do see linkages between these problems, and we're really, again, looking to ensure the stability and prosperity of the region and to address these crises.
Thank you. And, in addition to Tigray, I'm concerned about the Benishangul Gumuz region, which is home to several ethnic groups that are often targeted by ethnic-based violence. We've seen violence from December to April displace over 100,000 in the region. It's also the home to the GERD and everything that goes along with that. And we saw in December, the Amhara regional forces threatened to begin the second chapter of the war in Tigray in Benishangul. And there have been consistent levels of violence since then. So what is state and USA doing to address ethnic violence beyond Tigray? And what are indicators for escalated violence and plans to respond to them and prevent a further deterioration of the situation?
Congresswoman, we are deeply concerned about the conflict elsewhere beyond Tigray in Ethiopia. We have engaged diplomatically. Certainly, we've spoken to the Prime Minister about it, many other Ethiopian government officials. We are urging an inclusive dialogue to help Ethiopia address these challenges. We have offered some suggestions and ideas on what that might look like to assist. In addition, we have a range of programs run through USAID and other U.S. government agencies that are intended to really build bridges, help bring people together, address the festering grievances that are out there, the long running border disputes and other challenges that are out there. So we've got a range of activities underway in an effort to address the problem.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Juan Vargas of California, who is the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere, Civilian Security, Migration, and International Economic Policy for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And once again, I do appreciate you bringing up these issues that are so important. And I thank your leadership for that. I also want to thank the witnesses today. A number of the questions that I have been asked, but I want to ask them a little bit more to give you more time. I do have great concern about famine. I agree with Mr. Kim that I wish we had another word and not such a technical word, because the reality is what's happening there is starvation because of the conflict, and we have to do more. Now, I have to say also, I agree very much with Mr. Malinowski. We have great faith in not only our own country, but also in the World Food Program. You know, an American runs that program now, David Beasley. I think he has heroic leadership. I think that they earned the Nobel Peace Prize because of the work that they're doing. And if they give them a chance, they can do something here also to save so many lives. Now, the access has been the issue. But how have things changed now, not only because of the ceasefire, but because of also the military reality that just happened this last week? I mean, it almost seems like you'd be able to get more access potentially than less. I don't know. When I first heard about it, I thought maybe there was an opportunity here.
Thank you for that, Congressman. The World Food Program is a critical partner of ours, and as much as we talk about the places and the people that tragically we can't access, we are reaching more than 3.5 million people with emergency food assistance, working with partners like the World Food Program, like Catholic Relief Services and others to reach those that are in need. It's still very early days. The situation on the ground is fluid. We do welcome the Ethiopia in order to